Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tools and beyond the headlines. Last month, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan declared ambassadors from 10 Western allies, including the US and Germany, persona non grata. Turkey backtracked a few days later, but it's an indicator of something else, a deep economic and political crisis. Turkey's economy is in turmoil, with inflation hitting possibly as high as 30% and unemployment soaring. Many people wonder whether Erdogan's days in office are numbered. With us here today to discuss that spat and the economic crisis, we have Ayla Jean Yackley, an Istanbul-based reporter and contributor to the Financial Times. Hello and welcome, Ayla.
Thanks, Nick. Looking forward to our talk.
Good. Let's dive into it straight away. Let's talk about that spat first of all. It seems pretty odd targeting 10 of your allies for possible sort of effective expulsion. What was behind that?
Story is about a gentleman named Osman Kavala. He's been in prison without a conviction. In fact, he's even been acquitted of one crime since 2017. And the United States, as well as 9 other allies, including European partners, New Zealand, Canada, issued a joint statement. It was a bit remarkable for them to do this, but they called on Turkey, they called on Erdogan to respect European Court of Human Rights rulings ordering his release. And Erdogan, over the course of a few days, said that this was unacceptable, and it all sort of climaxed when in a speech, he said that they should be declared persona non grata. And effectively, that would amount to expelling them from Turkey. One diplomat involved in that has described the response as shocking, but that the Turkish side, the foreign ministry and others in Erdogan's circle of advisors were more shocked than the ambassadors by his response. And the reason for such an extreme response, that one, something that we can parse. Erdogan tends to, his form of nationalism tends to rely on a sense that many Turks share with him that foreign powers are intervening and meddling in Turkish affairs. There might also be some, merit that he believes that this gentleman, Osman Kavala, who's a well-known in certain circles. He's a philanthropist. He's a civil rights activist. He's not known to people on the street in Turkey. He's not a household name by any means, but the government has repeatedly depicted him as a George Soros lackey. And so it seems as though Erdogan may believe that he was somehow involved in the 2 sort of critical events that he's accused of. He's been implicated in, which were in 2013, the largest anti-government protests in a generation. And then after he was acquitted of involvement in that, he was subsequently charged with involvement in the 2016 military coup attempt. So it's an interesting dynamic, but I think that one reading that has merit is that Erdogan felt that he could tap into that sentiment that a lot of voters feel, that that it's a bit conspiratorial, but this guy must have some key role that foreign powers are trying to exploit if they would go to bat and try and defend him. And just to wrap this up, how was this, to explain how the crisis was, averted in the end, over the course of a weekend. I think there was a lot of traffic between the foreign ministry and these embassies, and the United States tweeted effectively, it's a reiteration of its compliance with the Venice Convention, which says it does not interfere in the internal affairs of another country. Interestingly, the Turkish translation was different than the English, and that was deliberate to leave a little bit of ambiguity. The United States and the other missions declared that they remain committed to their pursuit of greater human rights and civil liberties in Turkey. But Erdogan was also able to cast it as his own victory. He said it was a reversal, it was an apology, and that these countries would never again interfere in Turkey's internal affairs. So that's sort of how it wound up. But it's was a really dramatic and interesting example of these tensions that Turkey has with some of its closest partners.
As you say, the reverberations of what's happened before. I mean, we know after the coup that Turkey was very keen to get there's a Turkish leader in the United States. You will say possibly more about him. There've been tensions over that. So these things aren't new, but the context in which this is taking is new. Erdogan's reputation has been based on huge economic growth, and the growth that has taken place in Turkey over the last 2 decades is phenomenal. But there is a sense now that is actually the thing that he has staked his reputation on is now actually his very shaky ground for him.
That's true. I mean, the economy has been in the doldrums for a number of years. I did some back of the envelope math yesterday for a story, and in dollar terms, per capita income over the last decade has declined from about $12,000 annually to about $8,500 now. So that tells you that people who have supported Erdogan for a variety of reasons, but very much, I think the main one being the economy and the growth that he was able to bring, now are feeling the pinch. So coupled with, declining incomes in real terms, we have, as you said, inflation. Officially, it's 20%, but independent economists say it's more like 50% based on their data. Exactly. We have unemployment that has been stuck in the double digits for most of the past 5-6 years, with a dip here and there. And that also masks the actual labor force participation rate. That's something it's more like about half of those who are of age and can work are working. And so these issues, like inflation in particular, I know that's an issue in a lot of countries right now following the pandemic, but in Turkey as in elsewhere, inflation really hurts the middle class and the working class more than anyone else, because a bigger portion of their income goes to things like food and rent, and those are the areas that are leading the rise. So all of this has conspired. I mean, people in opinion polls repeatedly cite the economy along with joblessness and inflation as the number one reason, their number one complaint right now. And that has coincided with a fall to a record low approval rating for Erdogan's party.
So the currency has fallen about 5 times against the dollar. I mean, that's a sort of significant drop. But I'm just thinking about on sort of everyday things. How much has the cost of bread changed for people?
Bread is subsidized. So that one is, bread is, bread they've kept steady, relatively steady. Things like electricity, household, at the consumer level, they've also have also prevented price rises in areas that they control. They have prevented dramatic price rises, but things like rent, they can't. So you've got official inflation of about 20%. Imagine your rent increasing, 20% per year while your income remains stagnant. And okay, so bread remains affordable, but if you go to a restaurant, if you go to the grocery store, you will feel sticker shock. And the way that the government has decided to tackle this issue of inflation, it isn't through the usual orthodox sort of monetary policy. That's what's really significant here. Typically, if you've got like rampant inflation at these levels, what you have to do is raise interest rates to bring down demand, to bring down the supply of money. But Erdogan wants to see the economy continue to grow. He thinks that that's the best way to increase employment, for instance. And so to do that, he has pressured the central bank governor, who has been very pliant, to keep interest rates essentially below inflation. So if you were an investor, why would you buy Turkish treasury bonds? Because you're actually getting less once inflation's factored in on the yield. But some of the more unconventional ways that he's gone about trying to rein in prices is through sort of kind of bullying. He has raided and fined grocery stores. The biggest grocery store chains have been accused of price gouging, and he has levied huge fines on grocery store chains. That's going to backfire. What will happen is that those costs will be passed on, those fines will be passed on eventually to consumers, is the expectation. And just, another point about this unorthodox policy, Erdogan describes himself as an enemy of interest rates. And rooted in that might be his religious convictions. Islam sees interest as haram. And so that might be a factor, but there's a few others. And one of them is almost like a mercantile approach to the economy. If you're a small business owner and you're paying a high interest on a loan, that's a cost, and that's a cost that you pass on. So he believes that interest rate drives inflation. But there's also something that is a bit more conventional in his philosophy. He clearly wants to devalue the Turkish lira to some extent. And that, again, is done probably to encourage export growth. So the hope is that, Turkey can it can compete more in Europe, its biggest market, and in other markets by selling these cheap goods. But again, these aren't sustainable things. Turkey imports a lot of products to make its exports. It imports almost all of the fuel that it uses to run power plants, to run factories. And, job growth has been stagnant despite crazy growth rates. So the model that he's pursuing feels the best thing I can say about it feels very short term. And that's probably because it's tied to an election cycle rather than some kind of fundamental, expectations of laying the structural underpinning.
So he's hoping to do just enough so he can stay in power. The next elections are due in 2023, but possibility of coming earlier?
In Turkey, it's always good to assume that there'll be an early election because there's been, we've actually gone now 2.5 years without an election, and it's a breath of fresh air. So he does rely on calling early elections to sort of renew his mandate. And there is more and more speculation that he'll do that soon because of some of these economic measures that he's taken, that he clearly wants to just, prime the pump, get the economy kind of booming, won't be able to sustain that. So he'll clearly need to go to elections soon. But he has repeatedly said no. The next election is slated for 2023. That coincides with the centennial of the founding of the Turkish Republic. And it's kind of a magical date. There's a lot of expectations that the earliest will be maybe a 6-month, he'll pull them forward 6 months to the beginning of 2023, but there's a lot of expectations that he would. And based on those poll numbers where I mentioned that, he's seeing record low approval ratings, it's a risk to go to elections now. He might want to prepare the ground a bit more before he takes that leap.
I want to take a step back a bit because I think what everyone's suggesting is that Erdogan could be voted out. And that really is quite significant. He's been there for 19 years, and his impact on the Turkish economy, but also on Turkish society, has been huge, and also in terms of Turkey's relations with the rest of the world. So I want to step back a bit and just remind ourselves of how he came to power and what the significant changes that he brought about. Why was his election to power such a big shift? And perhaps we can go back to him he was a mayor in Istanbul. He's a sort of, in a way, he's a political street fighter. He comes from a very different background, but also with a very Islamist bent as well. And that was a big change for Turkey.
Absolutely. And before his party was elected in November 2002, again, the 19th anniversary of their election was, I believe, yesterday. There was a lot of efforts by the secular old guard to block him from running. He was jailed in the late 1990s for reciting a poem that was deemed reactionary. And that conviction was used to prevent him from being on the ticket with his party in 2002. But his party won with such an overwhelming mandate. They essentially sidelined every mainstream party. There were only, Turkey's parliament was, very fractious, like a lot of parliaments can be. And in that election, they were able to sideline every single center-right, other center-right party. And there were only two parties that entered parliament. And it was such a strong mandate that there was a sense that blocking his political career would have backfired. And so he was allowed to run in a by-election in early 2003. Again, the secular old guard looked at his Islamic background, some of the more sort of fiery things he'd said over the years, and warned that he was in clear violation of Turkey's secular constitution. But the way that he ran his campaign his party's campaign back in 2002 was that he had reformed. I mean, he said that I no longer see myself as an Islamist politician. He depicted his party as closer to, say, the Christian Democrats in Germany, in which religion is an issue, but they remain, committed to the secular order. And then he set about, over the course of the first 5-6 years of his rule, hewing to that, much more a traditional center-right party than by any means an Islamist party, learning from the lessons of Turkey's first Islamist prime minister, who had been pushed out of power in 1998 by the military. And so he did this sort of dance with the military for a long time. He focused his energies on Turkey's European Union project. He secured formal negotiations with the EU. He also focused his energies on the economy, helping it to grow significantly. And that, a lot of people were won over by his capable handling of the economy and foreign policy. And he also built alliances with certain figures inside the bureaucracy. And namely, I'm thinking of followers of the Fethullah Gülen movement, who had, were quite dominant in the police, in the judiciary, and as it turns out, in the military. As we discovered later, the military had always been the self-described guardians of Turkish secularism. And so he spent, the first 5 to 10 years, even maybe more like 8 years, very much hewing to a more traditional mainstream political.
I remember a report that came out from the European Stability Initiative, sort of really praising Turkey's advances, and I think it was called the Islamic Calvinists. And so it was the idea of Turkey was working very hard, and it had got these ideas from the Gastarbeiters who'd gone to Turkey, had come back. They bought these sort of, manufacturing methods, and Turkey was booming, but at the same time embracing you could have an Islamic culture, you could be a good Muslim alongside it. Whereas previously the CHP had, women couldn't wear the veil, and there were so many restrictions replaced upon that identity. So he managed to bring those two things together very, very successfully, but then becomes more repressive, as he asserts control on power.
Absolutely. So those first few years are spent negotiating, this very difficult terrain in which the secular establishment, the old guard, still dominates the judiciary, the military, even though he did have some allies in those institutions. So he's very conciliatory. He acknowledges the concerns. He's, just so much, the firebrand that we know today, he had a different persona back then. He allied himself with liberals, even leftists. He talked early on about his respect for gay rights, his convictions very much were more progressive, it seemed back then. And I think that you raise a really good point, Nick, and that is that he was also seen by many, these liberals in Turkey, people who didn't necessarily identify, might be secular in their lifestyle and in their outlook, but found that the old Kemalist version of secularism very repressive, and that the authoritarian state that was there since 1980 as being very undemocratic. The role of the military was really problematic. It could intervene in domestic policies and affairs and prevent the government from acting. So he won over people from that side. And those people argued that this is a country that's 99.9% Muslim, at least on paper, at least officially. And we have to come to terms with that. We can't live as if we are a non-Muslim state. He, for some people, offered this promise of, in a way, normalizing political Islam, of making it more mainstream, of this blend of sort of free market principles, a pro-EU stance, respect for civil liberties, and reining in the military. All those ideas would also perhaps moderate political Islam. The United States back then, this is back in 2003, 2004, always liked to talk about Turkey as a model for the Muslim world, that you could have, moderate Islam, and a country, could be run that you don't need to have the sort of dictatorships that you saw in Egypt and in Iraq, let's say, to keep political Islam at bay. That it could be brought into the mainstream.
So bringing things, I mean, we're sailing through a lot of time here, but in terms of history, that in terms of his electorate, that's how they view him. They view him as providing economic growth and this ability to express their Islamic identity, and that sort of sense of conservatism as well, despite what you've said about the sort of liberal side of things. So if you lived in Anatolia, you lived in a small regional town, this was your guy. It doesn't matter, he comes from Istanbul, he represents you. But increasingly, I mean, that's a significant shift for Turkey. But then he becomes more authoritarian, and then also we have the coup, and then the constitutional changes that follow that. And I now look at Erdogan, and I think of him alongside Putin, one of the strong men who represents himself as a strong man in Europe, within the region, and therefore his demise seems improbable to me, because he's managed to secure so much power around himself, both economically, in terms of the sort of, the ability, what we look at as oligarchs around him, his holding within the party, but also constitutionally. So can you just talk about his grip on power? Because that's what makes what's happening now so significant. The economy is in a sort of downward spiral. He hasn't got a grip on it. He's panicking ahead of an election. And yet this is the guy who had so much, everyone feared, and he had so much control.
It's important to keep in mind that his power does, I think, mostly stem from his popularity. He remains the single most popular politician in Turkey. There are polls that show a coalition candidate from the CHP, led by the CHP, would defeat him in an election. There is evidence that he's much less popular than he used to be, but on his own, he remains Turkey's most popular politician. So that is where most of his power comes from. And he has done something that's quite remarkable. He is still viewed as a man of the people, as the guy from the tough waterfront neighborhood in Istanbul, whose roots are in Anatolia along the Black Sea. Despite dominating Turkey for 20 years, he still refers to the CHP, out of power since the late 1970s, as the party of elites. So that is where that comes from. Another point that I think is important to make is that Erdogan is very, very powerful, and he does wield just a tremendous amount of influence. And yet he has always had to form some form of coalitions to rule Turkey. One example, there's been, parties. Right now he is in an alliance with the far right ultranationalist party, but in the past he's allied himself with Kurds, and he's benefited from their votes. He's allied himself in the bureaucracy, as I mentioned, with the Gülenists. He's always had to, there always is a little bit of power sharing. I mean, he might get the biggest share of the pie because he is the face of this movement, but he has always had to negotiate relationships, because despite winning an outright majority in the 2018 presidential race, he does struggle to get 50% of the support. So that's just an important note to make, that he does have to share some power.
Okay, I've got more questions, particularly about his sort of grip on power and the constitutional changes he brought in. But let's bring in some other questions we've got questions coming in from our audience now. So let's turn to those first, and I'm sure there'll be more to follow as well. First of all, we've got Sir Harold Walker, who's there with a good question. And I thought this one. Hooky, we can see the top of you. There we go. Go ahead.
Ask my two questions. A very detailed question. Is it known why the UK ambassador was not with the 10 complaining on human rights grounds? And much more general comment and question. As a newspaper reader, it's always seemed to me that Erdogan deals with foreign affairs on a very personal basis. I mean, back in the time of the Arab Spring, he took offense that Bashar al-Assad wouldn't take his advice, and that really seemed to change his policy. Do his personal views, the way does he treat internal as well as external politics very much as a personal matter?
Sure. Okay, I'll start with your first question on the UK. That I don't have specific information about why the UK wasn't on it, but it wasn't surprising. The UK has very much sought to have a good relationship with Turkey, mainly for commercial and trade reasons following Brexit. So that's a big part of it. They have, I believe, negotiated a separate trade deal. And things like human rights in foreign policy are less, from what I understand of British foreign policy, they're less of a priority for this government. And so it didn't surprise many people that they weren't on there. They tend to work kind of behind the scenes with Turkey. That's not to say that there isn't any effort by the British ambassador to advocate for the release of political prisoners, let's say. It's just that it's done in a much more subdued, less public way. And that's, I think, a very astute reading of how foreign policy works here. Everything's personal for Erdogan. He runs this country like, I don't know if this is maybe going too far, but like he owns it in some ways. And his politics are very personal. That's true. He takes offense very easily. For instance, something like 38,000 people were investigated last year for insulting him, for instance. The opposition leader has paid hundreds of thousands of liras in fines for insulting him. So things are very personal here. And I think you're right. That is something that, that personal touch, let's say, to foreign policy. And by the way, Erdogan dominates foreign policy. The foreign minister doesn't really have a distinct kind of, presence or how should I put it? He very much fulfills the president's orders. The one storied Turkish foreign ministry has been largely, their expertise and all that has been largely sidelined under Erdogan. But I just wanted to make the note that personal touch, we saw that especially with Trump, that kind of mirror, he and Trump have that in common too. They see relationships as transactional. Erdogan really seems to have a huge amount of confidence in his persuasive powers. He has been seeking a meeting with Joseph Biden for so long. He couldn't reach him for months and months over the phone after he was elected. He finally spoke to him. Biden called Erdogan the day before he decided to recognize the Armenian genocide in a formal way. That was the first time he got a call from this very close ally. He did get one brief meeting with him on the sidelines of an international summit in, I believe it was June. And then he just kept petitioning to see him again. So he obviously has confidence that when he makes his case himself, he's able to do it. And yes, he's got, thin skin. You're right. I mean, he expressed personal disappointment in Assad's refusal to follow his advice on the protests that he was confronted with back in 2011. He has talked about how he won't openly denigrate the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, but he makes it clear that he only respects the prince's father. So he's made that personal as well. And, we see that in relationships across the board.
Great question. Thank you very much for that, Hookie.
Thank you.
I want to bring in Simon Jackson first, and because I think this fits well at this point, and I'll come to Diane Cook in a second. So Simon, go ahead with your question, please.
Erdogan has form attempting to overturn the results of elections he doesn't like. Is there a chance he could be, if he would accept the result of a general election if he lost it? And I suppose there's a follow-up question there, given that, as I recall, when he came to power, it was following a long series of unstable and corrupt coalitions. If the only way he could be beaten is by a coalition, is there any chance that would be attractive to the electorate if it has any sort of a memory?
That's a great question. And Erdogan often evokes that. He evokes the chaos, especially of the 1990s, when there was one coalition government after another that failing and a new one forming. But 25 years have passed. We have a whole new generation voting. So sort of the battled 90s doesn't quite frighten people the way that it may have, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But I also appreciate the point that you made, that one of the reasons why people took a chance on him, people who didn't necessarily support his more conservative ideas and background, was because Turkey had been just plagued by corruption, mafia, influence on the government, these weak coalitions. There was a bloody insurrection in the southeast that had killed, thousands. It just was that system that was in place, in which the military exerted influence, where the secularists dominated. It had rotted from the inside out. So his party, AK in Turkish, it's the acronym AK, Adalet ve Kalkınma, so justice and development. It actually means clean and white, but white in the sense of clean and pure. So he was very much seen as like a trustworthy figure, maybe because he was more religious. So the undoing of that image, I don't think that they enjoy that by any means anymore. The sense there's this feeling that corruption is so widespread. At best, he's forgiven for it because of the economic benefits that he has brought previously. So anyway, just I veered off there a bit. Your other question about, would he accept the results of an election he loses? I mean, that is the question that's on everyone's minds. I would argue, I have a friend who works on election issues in countries from Bangladesh to Ukraine, and she always says, you don't steal an election on election day. I mean, you create, the ground, such an unlevel playing field that you don't risk the turnout on, you don't risk an election on election day. So the expectation would be that through maybe some draconian measures against the opposition, there could be arrests, there could be party closures, that he would follow that route, that he would make the opposition much less potent beforehand. But there has been some, let's say, I don't want to say meddling because it's never been proven, but in that 2017 referendum that vastly expanded and sort of hypercharged the presidency, they had a constitutional referendum that made him this all-powerful president. There were things like unstamped ballots that were somehow discovered, and this was all public, were discovered, and nobody knows how many, but the high election board decided to count them that day. They didn't even sort of say, all right, we're going to earmark these and look at them if there's a problem in the closeness of the race. They just sort of mix them in. So they can fiddle with things on election day. And you're right, back in 2019, Erdogan's party barely lost the Istanbul mayoral race to the CHP figure, Ekrem İmamoğlu. Something like 12 or 13,000 votes separated them. And Erdogan refused to acknowledge that victory. He forced a rerun election, claiming irregularities that were not ever really proven. And his party lost by the largest margin in the history of Istanbul elections. So if he's taken any lesson from that, he's also realized that you can only block a vote to some extent. I'll say one more thing. I think I've been covering Turkey for too long. I'm quite cynical. I don't see how he could possibly. I just can't imagine Erdogan ever returning to the opposition. Can't see him as an opposition figure. What would he do if he thought he were going to lose? Would he do something dramatic like, cancel an election, something like that? And I was talking to these young students at Boğaziçi University, which has very much been targeted by Erdogan in recent months as he's tried to take over administration of that university. And these kids were so confident that there's no way that he could do that it would be these are political science students, by the way, so they know their stuff, but there was just something kind of moving about their confidence that despite all of the imperfections of Turkish democracy, that it hasn't been inclusive, that there are very sort of restrictive laws that prevent Kurds, for instance, from expressing their culture fully or being educated in their mother tongue. Despite the imperfections of Turkish democracy, the ballot box remains central and is sacred to Turks. And they've been casting ballots for a long, long time. So to do something that's, this isn't a 20 or 30-year-old democracy. It's much older than that. It's much more ingrained. And doing something like that would spell the end of his regime anyway. So they completely dismissed it. So
yeah, I'm fascinated by this because the opposition, the CHP, and also there's a more centrist political party that has evolved as well. They seem incredibly confident that if there is an election, that they're going to win. Can you balance that also against the powers that he gave himself with that constitution? What can he do to sort of to interfere in elections? What can he do to suppress the media? What things is he able to do? Obviously, the judiciary is very much within his hands as well. So what kind of things can he do to sort of suppress the opposition?
One blunt instrument with the judiciary is banning political parties, cutting off their financing, targeting politicians. The second largest opposition party is the HDP. Its base is overwhelmingly Kurdish. It faced a closure trial right now. Its former leader, a very charismatic politician who challenged Erdogan for the presidency twice. He never expected to win, but he's just such a vocal critic of Erdogan. It was still a very powerful campaign. He's been in jail for 5 years now. So he can use those sort of blunt instruments through the judiciary. The media is absolutely, 9 out of 10 newspapers and TV channels are either run outright by the government or by companies that are very close to the government. There is Twitter, there are online news sites where people can get a different view, but they're incredibly, these other news sites are underfunded. They struggle to cover Turkey. They also risk prosecution. Turkey's the largest jailer of journalists in the world. I think it still retains that title. So he really does dominate the media. He doesn't have to worry too much about that. He does have quite a few tools. And again, remember, he's by no means, a despised leader. He still remains, relatively popular. So.
Yeah, it's the economy that has really seized hold of people's mind, and the opposition seem to be pretty confident that that's going to dominate the debate. You move away from identity politics. You might have spats with your neighbors, but the fact that you can't afford to do lots of things you used to be able to, or you don't have a job, is the thing that dictates it. Diane Cook, you had a question that followed this up. Go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, Ayla, you mentioned, I think, that about 50% of the workforce is underemployed. And I'm just interested in, what that actually translates on the ground. How do they feed their families, and what do they expect out of life, and how that changes their political views?
There used to be a sort of fabric of family networks where people used to support each other and they could get by on relatively low incomes, but that's changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's changed with changing demographics, smaller families, fewer children, the great internal migration from the countryside to the city. One thing that people do is they do remain attached to their ancestral villages, and during hard times like the ones that we are now, we'll do things like go back, take a bus, go back to the village, buy or procure, through barter or whatnot, cheap food, and bring back grains, legumes, cheese from the village on buses to serve, and rely on those. Also, it's important to know that Turkey has a vast unregistered economy, and I don't know what the numbers are, where that overlaps between the labor participation force, which is about half, and how many of those people who aren't participating formally might be getting paid under the table. But that's a big part of it. For instance, for women especially. Women, I think, if I'm not mistaken, only about a third of women are part of the workforce, but they're the ones who are cleaning houses, are doing home health care, or looking after children. So there is an unregistered economy, but those wages tend to be lower. They don't have social security benefits, so they don't. It's difficult. They have to pay in separately if they're to receive health care and eventually some kind of pension. So I think that Nick makes a good point that there is a very solid fabric, very tightly woven social fabric for families. People do look after each other. They look after different generations. And by that, it can be quite expansive. Cousins are included here, aunts, uncles. I think they rely on them. But, I know a young woman who, finished high school, didn't go on to college, was really felt that she didn't need to, was really confident that she would find work and enough of a source of income. She didn't want to work. She wanted to raise children. She wound up with her husband buying a house. So she is up to her eyeballs in debt. So she's reluctantly gone back and is doing this sort of under the table work. And I talked to her quite often. She actually looked after my son before she was married. So we go way back. And I can't tell you just how her, there was a dream, a middle-class dream that she had. Her family comes from the Southeast, and they were quite poor, but she really was so confident when I first met her 10 years ago about her trajectory, and just how a home, a car, all these things were within sight. She realized her dream of buying a house, but she talks about how she'll have to, she'll won't be able to take a vacation until she's 45, and that to her seems ancient. So there's just this incredible disappointment. And she is a former Erdogan supporter, and says that because of the economy, she won't vote for him again. So she blames him. She holds him responsible for the sort of loss of her middle-class dream.
I think we are seeing a really significant sort of shift in sort of politics here, with the possibility of him going, and also it's a moment to reflect upon what he's done. I've got to say that Diane Cook was on our inaugural political tour, our first very tour we did with political tours in 2011 in Turkey. So,
oh, wow. And can I just add that quite a lot of what we saw has come to pass.
Wow. Do you want to share some examples? Or
well, one was the imprisonment of journalists, because it was really sort of kicking off then.
Yeah.
And I guess what I took from it was the idea that Erdogan was possibly going to be quite autocratic. And I think as an overarching theme, that really, I would suggest, has come to pass. I don't know if you agree, Nicholas.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very much so. It was a good tour. I mean, we started in Gaziantep, I think, or did we go the other way?
We went the other way.
We ended in Gaziantep. We started in Istanbul and Ankara, and then Gaziantep. It was a very
great
good
trip.
meet.
Great trip.
But the other thing perhaps that we didn't know back then was that the significant degree to which Erdogan was able to flex Turkish military muscle and exercise a foreign policy that gave Turkey power the one hadn't envisaged, and that really has changed. That's another big change that's happened in the past decade. So we've got two questions that relate to that. So let's go to Fran Hoffman first, and then Nigel Harley. So let's take Fran first. Go ahead, Fran.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just interested in post-coup attempt military relationships with Erdogan, and to what degree the military will play or not a role in domestic politics. I assume he put anti-coup measures in place after the failed attempt. Are they feeling well paid, well taken care of, or are they suffering the same economic insecurities as the rest of the population?
Let's hold Nigel's question for just a second. It relates to it, but let's deal with that question of the military and coup attempts, a perennial problem for Turkish politicians. What's changed since the coup?
I think the biggest change has been that they purged the military of anyone who was suspected of having sympathies or ties with the Gülenist movement, and as well as other sort of, let's call them factions of the military. It's now dominated by what are described as Eurasists. So people who do support officers who do support a closer relationship with Russia, with China, who are looking eastward, and the so-called NATO faction, those who'd gone and had training, let's say, in either the United States or in Brussels, they've been sidelined as well. One really significant thing that Erdogan did following the coup is he made the former chief of the general staff, so the top military commander, he made him his defense minister. So he took him out of this military role, put him in a civilian post. And he's an interesting figure. His name is Hulusi Akar. He does something that's, I just think it's just a detail, but I think you might find it interesting. He has kind of devised an outfit for himself. So you see him when he's visiting troops or even just holding, a press conference, he wears something that looks like a blend of a business suit and a military suit. It's this funny thing that only he has. Clearly, he hired a tailor to do this from. But I think it's actually quite symbolic. Like he is sort of trying to merge this idea of it's a new way of the military being involved in civilian politics. So I think that in general, the sense is that Erdogan does control, that sort of unruly, unhappy military has been vanquished, that he does control them. What people talk about now is what happens post Erdogan, like who would then control the military? And people talk about this defense minister. Therefore, because of this, he could be a successor to Erdogan because he does have the loyalty of the military. It's a great question, Fran. It seems as though they have been sent back to the barracks to a large extent. I have been covering Turkey for years and years, and I always knew the name of the military commander, this chief of general staff. I have no idea who he is now. He's not a part of the political landscape for me. So they have been sort of, in some ways, removed from politics, but you never know. I mean, they are powerful. They are factionalized still to some extent. There are still people who support that partnership with the West through NATO, while there are others who think that Turkey should become closer to Russia and China. So there are sort of explosive elements there that could create fault lines in the future.
Yeah, let's come back to Erdogan in just a second and talk about him and his health, because that's another question about his future as well. But Nigel Harley, as a follow-up question to the power of the military, just go ahead with your question. Go on. Nigel, your microphone needs opening. I'm going to ask Nigel's question for him, since we can't manage to hear him. He says, given the state of the Turkish economy, will the country be able to sustain their military involvement in Libya and Syria? And what would be the consequences? Do you want to say also, Ayla, what the strategic objective is in both those places?
So I don't think that there's any, I don't think people are seriously concerned about the issue of state finances affecting the military. For one thing, the military is a priority. So there'll be cuts in other places before there are in military capability. And it's, the government, it's a big part of the Erdogan's drive to make the military independent of foreign weapons, purchases, that Turkey will provide all of its own equipment by, I think, actually the initial target was 2023. That might be too early now, but so it's such a priority that I don't really think that is an issue. And, just on a side note about the economy, there's a lot of, even though there's a lot of things that are quite dire about it, whether it's inflation, unemployment, these things that affect Turks' daily lives, the government's budget is in pretty good shape. It gets high marks on the kind of fiscal side. There's no concerns about whether it's able to roll over its debt. So it isn't as though the country's about to implode by any means economically. So I think that with the military, there isn't that much concern. Nicholas, you had a follow-up to that, didn't you?
Yeah, my question was, I think it's one of the expansion of Turkish power in foreign relations has been in combination with using the military. So you've seen, Turkish intervention in Libya, significantly, pitted against some surprising countries, and then also obviously in Syria as well. So you've seen an expansion of Turkey's foreign policy with military power.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, and I think they've something like, they did over the last decade triple spending on the military. So it's been an investment. Don't quote me on that number, but it's been a significant increase. Absolutely. So how Erdogan has explained that new, much more assertive policy, because, just to back up, Ataturk, the founder of the Republic, espoused this idea of peace at home, peace in the world, that it was a non-expansionary, it was fully dedicated to the defense of its borders, other than with the exception of
Ottoman, if you like, not trying to be imperialistic.
Exactly. With the exception of the 1974 invasion of Cyprus, it had no, there was no, wasn't expeditionary by any means. And so it really hewed to that line. Erdogan, this dramatic change in which you've got Turkey involved in conflicts from Libya, it's across the border in Iraq, it's invaded Syria 4 times to fight the Kurds and to fight Islamic State. It was supposed to be a neutral negotiator in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It was part of the Minsk group, the OSCE body that was supposed to negotiate a solution to this problem. It jettisoned that and supplied Azerbaijan with not only drones that gave it the decisive edge, but there's reliable information, including from the UN, that it sent Syrian mercenaries to help fight on the side of the Azerbaijani army. It's in countries, I think something like 9 or 10 different countries, as it keeps a permanent military presence. And Erdogan has described this dramatic change as one of the things he said is that before, whether it's our allies in the West or our enemies or our rivals elsewhere, they didn't respect us. They didn't listen to what we said. We had to go along with whatever they imposed upon us. But since we've become so much more assertive, they will defer to us. So he's described it as being a really effective foreign policy tool, backing up, using hard power to back up his foreign policy objectives. There are problems with it, though, because it can sometimes feel a bit piecemeal or patchwork. So you've got the example of Libya. in which they surprised everybody by, I think it was late 2019, signing an agreement with the UN recognized government in Tripoli. And it was an energy and defense agreement. And people didn't take it that seriously. But within 3 months, Turkey's drones and its boots on the ground completely changed the course of that conflict between the UN recognized government and the Russian, UAE, and France-backed rebel commander Haftar. And I think in the end, the US was actually quite pleased with how that went. But then you've also got something like the dispute in the Eastern Mediterranean when Turkey sent warships to go accompany its drilling ships in internationally recognized Greek waters, and came to the brink of conflict with a NATO partner. And in that role, it was really just trying to play the spoiler. It wanted to complicate Greece and Cyprus and other members of this East Mediterranean Natural Gas Forum, which includes Israel and Lebanon and Egypt, just complicate their effort to extract natural gas. So you can see how the fact that it's patchwork sometimes works well, like Libya. What is Turkey? Turks didn't support that, by the way, when it was first announced, because it's a faraway country. What do we have? We have nothing to do with it. Erdogan tried to link it to the period in which there was Ottoman rule there. That's a reason to be there, but mainly people just scratched their heads, and yet it worked out very much in Turkey's favor. But then you also have the fact that it risked sanctions. It pissed off its partners in Europe. Relations with Greece were at an all-time low because of its, this assertive foreign policy.
Ayla, this has been a fantastic overview. I mean, we've got a real good sense of the enormous shifts that have taken place while Erdogan has been in office. At the same time, there is this sense of a man possibly in decline. There are rumors about his health. Okay, he's only 67, which by many dictators, I shouldn't say authoritarian leaders' instincts is very young, a long way to go yet. But at the same time, there seems to be a sense of him losing touch, chucking tea bags out of a bus to please his voters. That didn't strike me as the right tone to be setting with people who are unhappy about losing their jobs.
No, it's true. There's a lot of speculation that his health is quite poor, that there's even rumors that he could be potentially on death's door. As someone who has followed him for so long, I see that that old zip at his step might be missing, but he still is incredibly vital. Like he can still give a really raucous speech, and so he might not be like, again, he might be a little bit slower in the steps he takes. Nobody really knows it's his actual health situation. It's just so many rumors. Everybody knows somebody who's a doctor who has this information. The rumor mill is going very strong right now. But I would say that, without credible information about his health, let's just assume that he is in good health. But you raised another point. You talked about that sense of being out of touch. And I think that is something that we're seeing more. Again, this idea of a man from the streets who knows his people so well, he comes from them, that persona that he's been able to preserve despite being in charge for 20 years, and building palaces and having, something like 14 jets, he still has that kind of that touch. We're seeing signs that he might be losing that touch. The tea bags is a great example. He chucked the tea bags at people who had just endured the worst wildfires in the history of the Republic. He showed up to give a speech, and then from his fast-moving bus, threw out tea bags at people. But
and normally, giving tea to people might be seen as a good offering, but this was
tea's not going quite far enough right now. It doesn't, and maybe that would have worked 20 years ago, but but now people expect more. It's this middle class dream that seems to be eclipsing people. In the past, just food handouts, coal handouts, things like that were enough to sort of to sway people, to win them over. But people have bigger aspirations. They have more consumer demands. They want cars and refrigerators and houses, The correspondent for the FT, my colleague Laura Patel, just wrote a really fantastic story. And by the way, I think the FT's firewall might still be down. They took it down for a couple of days. So if you get a chance, please read her story. And I'll put the link in the chat box, in which she does describe a man who, and this concurs with some of the reporting that I've done as well, where his inner circle has gotten incredibly small. He doesn't trust anybody outside of his family. He's got maybe one or two other advisors that he trusts. And he refuses to hear unhappy or unpleasant news. So when he's told that, people are unhappy on the street, his response is, I know the street better than anybody. That's where I'm from, even though he hasn't been mixing with people at that level for 20 years. So there is, again, it's impossible to answer the questions about his health, maybe not. But the fact that he doesn't have his finger on the pulse of the country, I think we're seeing more and more evidence of that. And that might be because he is so disconnected that he doesn't have people that he trusts to listen to about how he's viewed now.
So Ayla, last question then, and you've got three options. Will he be here in 2 years' time? Will he be gone, or no comment? I'm not a prognosticator, but I would say I expect him to be here. Yeah, I think he's 69, I think. Here's the thing, I think he'll die in office. I don't know if he'll die in 2 years. I don't know if he'll die in 10, but I think he'll die in office. His heroes are people who've died in office. That's who he's emulated. Menderes, the prime minister who was executed after a coup in 1960. He also admires Özal, who brought forth market reforms to Turkey in the 1980s after that coup. So that's my guess, but really anything can happen. Ayla, thank you so much. It's been a really, really good conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.